From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow on Wednesday for a 4-day state visit. It is President Xi Jinping's 11th visit to Russia, and it comes at a significant moment as it coincides with the milestone of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese people's resistance against the Japanese aggression. Also, the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, otherwise known as the Great Patriotic War, which are all part of the sacrifices and the victory of peace during the World War II. Now, in an article published on a major Russian newspaper titled "Learning from History to Build Together a Brighter Future," President Xi Jinping emphasized China's commitment to peace and underscored the pivotal role the stable China-Russia relationship plays in the current shifting global landscape. Now, as tensions rise across multiple fronts globally, what is the significance of President Xi's state visit to Moscow? And how can the stability of China-Russia ties serve as an anchor in a world facing escalating conflicts? Joining us to explore all these questions and more, we have in Moscow, Russia, Mark Sleboda, an international relations and security analyst. In Shanghai, China, we have Zhao Long, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Institute of the International Strategic and Security Studies at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. In our Beijing studio, we have Rong Ying, Chair Professor at Sichuan University and Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the Hub. Professor Rong Ying, always great to have you with us. Thanks so much for making it today a very important visit, a back-to-back visit, back-to-back summit between President Xi and President Putin. Of course, we have the 80th anniversary of the victory of peace for World War II. A commemorative event coming up in the Red Square that is expected, and of course a summit between President Xi and Putin. What do you make of the significance of this visit?
Yeah, indeed, I think this is a very significant sort of diplomatic event, and indeed, I think one of the most important head of state diplomacy of China. And certainly, I think we are very much looking forward to not only consolidate, broaden the bilateral relationship between China and Russia, which is, we call it a kind of a all-round comprehensive strategic coordination and consultation for a new era. And this relationship, as you said, and we agree that it is not it's significant, goes much beyond the bilateral. It has strategic, long-term sort of significance. And also, I think since President Xi would attend the 80th anniversary marking the victory, the Soviet Union's great Patriotic War, and also, of course, Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression, and the world anti-fascist war. So, big event commemorating a big sort of occasion, and also meeting, I think, at the celebration, meeting other head of a state, government attending the meeting. But last but not least, I think the visit took place at a very significant and critical area where the international system and international order is undergoing, facing up a lot of challenges, unprecedented, and need stability, I think, predictability. That is exactly, I think, China and Russia are working on, and that is exactly the occasions like commemorating the victory and also the founding of the United Nations and the post-war international order. I mean, so very significant visit. A lot of certainly symbolism, but more importantly also a lot of substance, particularly in terms of China and Russia relations.
Yeah, the international world order is being tested and strained, to put it mildly. Mark, let me turn to you. What do you make of the substance as well as the strategic symbolism of Chinese President Xi Jinping standing alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin, alongside other world leaders, with the likes of Brazilian President Inácio Lula da Silva, during showing up at the same time during a commemorative event in Moscow, Russia? What message does that send to the rest of the world?
Well, there are some 29 world leaders that will be in Moscow for the 80th anniversary of Russia's the Allied victory over Nazi Germany and its European fascist allies, and undoubtedly the arrival of the Chinese president is the most important guest for historical reasons, but also for modern geopolitical reasons. The first message it sends, straight out, is that a re-understanding of history by the collective West and an attempt to impose this kind of fan fiction Saving Private Ryan narrative on the world will not be tolerated. It will not be accepted, because the foundation of relations today is built on a proper historical understanding of events, of the great sacrifices of the Soviet and the Chinese people made during that conflict, what they endured and what they accomplished. We recently heard from President Trump trying to claim that the United States played the greatest role in both World War victories, and this is not only just factually incorrect, but morally repugnant. I think there is also a second modern geopolitical, and that is the U.S.-led collective West. And here I have to say that U.S. leadership has become somewhat more nuanced and complicated since Donald Trump assumed the office. But the attempt by the West to dictate to the world that they must stop trade, that they must stop relations with Russia because of the Western proxy war on Russia in Ukraine, it is something that the rest of the world outside of the West does not accept. And China plays the strongest and lead position alongside Russia, without necessarily taking sides in the conflict in Ukraine. China says the West does not dictate our trade and political relations with our partners, and that Russia is the most important of those.
Yeah, I mean, for many Americans, World War II is Pearl Harbor, it's Normandy landing, and for some, it's perhaps the Incheon landing in Korea. But hey, let's not forget the rape of Nanking, of the colonization of Manchuria, the great sacrifices, the Battle of Stalingrad, to say the least. I think that's also why President Xi Jinping published this brilliant article in Chinese and Russian on a major Russian news outlet, emphasizing the importance of having this, what he calls correct perspective on World War II history, and the importance of upholding fairness in building an equitable multilateral world going forward. Professor Zhao Long, what do you make of President Xi's emphasis on having this correct view on World War II history?
Well, I think I do share the vision of my colleagues just mentioned, the historical background or dimension of this visit. I think China and Russia were, let's say, the two principal theaters of World War II, both in Asia and Europe. So our nation paid extraordinary cost to defeat fascism. So that's kind of a shared historical triumph, become the moral and political foundation of this, current post-war international order, and in funding of UN, for example, the UN charters and all those principles in the global governance. But I think beyond this historical significance, there is also contemporary strategic logic of this Russian-China engagement, because we are living in an era where the unilateralism is rising, resurging, power politics is back on the table, and geopolitical competition is intensifying. So in this context, I think China and Russia are clearly coordinating more closely to push back against so-called Western-dominated international system, and jointly to voice for more equal, multipolar world order and more inclusive model of globalization to reaffirm our commitment to secure so-called post-war order, war world order, or in particular post-Cold War world order. So I think this makes a great significance both from the historical background and also the contemporary logic.
Yeah, well, great insights. Professor Rong Ying, President Xi, in this article published in a Russian newspaper, said that people should not forget that the Chinese people and the Russian people, the Soviets, paid great sacrifices as the key players in the Asia theater as well as the Europe theater, fighting Nazi Germany, fighting Japanese militarism and aggression. I'm reminded of the Oxford scholar by the name of Rana Mitter, who called Chinese and the Soviets the forgotten ally. What do you make of President Xi's emphasis on, people having to remember that part of history?
I think first and foremost, it's just a historical fact. And both China and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, has paid sacrifice and contribution for the victory of that war against the fascism, against the militarism in Japan and others. And that is a fact. But unfortunately, I think we have seen that there are efforts to distort or deny that fact. So that's why I think President Xi in his article calling upon we have to pursue a kind of correct historical perspective. So that's the most important thing. And I've also have to remember the heroes and heroines that has given their lives for the victory, for the peaceful peace and stability that we enjoyed. 80 years later. And for that, I think both, again, Chinese and the Russians and former Soviet people, Soviet Unions, their contribution, their sacrifice is so important. We're talking about, in our case, case of, I think, 35 million Chinese, both military and civilian. We're talking about 440 million Soviet Soviet Union.
So we pay the greatest sacrifices in terms of human toll,
exactly,
than the West can possibly perceive.
Exactly. So it's fair to say, and it's certainly an object. The fact that to recognize that, recognize this contribution and the sacrifice, and also between China and Russia, for the Soviet Union, if I can, we have been to win the victory. We have been mutually supporting each other. We have been fighting shoulder to shoulder. We shared our blood together for that victory. So I think for younger generations, for the generations in the future, our kids, our grandsons, granddaughters, this is also very much important. This is very much important. Last but not least, I think the post-war sort of international order that has been established in the wake of that victory, China and Russia and for the Soviet Union has played a very important role the first to sign the UN Charter, and also I think making the system work. That is also very much important. So history, not forgotten, certainly can be a mirror of the future. But the most important thing, the history should never be forgotten, and the sacrifice and the contributions made by, the people, China and Russia, should never be forgotten. I think.
Yeah, the atrocities of history should never be repeated. Mark, when many of the kids growing up in America or in some other Western countries, when they were asked who liberated the Nazi concentration camps in Eastern Europe, in Poland, etc., they won't hesitate in saying that it's the American soldiers, but in fact, it's the Red Army of the Soviet Union. So what do you make of the fact that, of course, anti-communism took precedence over anti-fascism since 1945, and therefore China and Russia became this forgotten ally of the West, whereby, in fact, the Americans, the British, and the French fought alongside the Soviets and the Chinese during World War II. And now we're living in this fragmented world, divided largely by the communist sphere of influence versus the NATO-led West. At this point in time, what do you make of the commemorative event happening in Moscow at this juncture of history?
Yeah, I've seen widely published polls, you can find them on social media, showing that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the European peoples, I think, particularly highlighted was the French people, France having endured Nazi occupation for much of World War II, that the French people were asked which country contributed most to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of France. And at the time, it was something like 90% of the French people recognized that the Soviet Union did the lion's share of the work in that regard. And in the modern day, that number has fallen to the low teens. Showing how much of a distortion of history has occurred. And I think that the use of the term forgotten is misleading and entirely too passive in this sense, because there is a very active rewriting of history that includes a modern geopolitical demonization, first of the Soviet Union, continuing now with Russia, and we can also talk, of course, about China in the eastern side of the conflict, being demonized and thus, not forgotten, but excised from memory and actively rewritten into a more modern Western geopolitical interpretation of history. And that is important because it entails a continuing effort not only to raise themselves up, but that their own people forgot that that they were once allies. It's very Orwellian in the sense we were always at war with Eurasia. That is the Orwellian scope of the rewriting of history. And on such a significant day, why is 80 so important? Part of the reason it's so important is because there's so few living veterans of that conflict left, right? That we can still honor their sacrifice today. The next round number we hit, there may not be any left that can be celebrated in the living flesh. It will only then be memory, and that is why memory is so important right now. And I think that the presence of the Russian and the Chinese president together, maybe celebrating is too strong a word, but mourning as well, that the cost must not be forgotten, because that could lead to a repetition. And indeed, it must be said that with the proxy war that the United States and all of NATO is waging today in Ukraine, with so many Banderite fascist elements within the Kiev regime's military and political structures, there are many Russians that say that the war continues today, that what Russia is fighting in Ukraine is a Banderite fascism that has been, the World War II Nazi collaborators in West Ukraine, that has been nurtured and regrown by the West as part of a modern geopolitical expansion into the post-Soviet space.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate what's happening in Eurasia today. So it is, in South Asia, where India and Pakistan, they're engaged in quite a bit of fighting. But let's move on. Director Zhao Long, many people say that China's diplomacy is at its finest where its action speaks louder than words. If you think about its, solitude role of fighting the Japanese aggression by itself in the large part of the 1930s and early 1940s, helping establish and abide by the UN and its charters, and now, playing a very active role in building in helping with the rise of the global South, a new world order. What do you make of all this in light of President Xi's visit to Russia?
Well, I think the numbers of the leaders who are attempting to attend this ceremony really tells there's a growing consensus that even the shared expectations on those major powers like China to show our commitment to safeguarding so-called historical truth of World War II, and even further defending the legitimacy of post-war international order, in particular, the function of UN and related, institutions. So I think China has devoted and continually committed to secure the post-war international order, and together, not only with Russia, but also with the countries in Global South. So I think China is really pioneering in that direction, and the significance and contribution of Beijing already be recognized by all those Global South countries. So that's why I think when Xi decided to join this ceremony together with Russian leaders and to show our commitment to this post-war international order, was supported by almost all those developing countries and Global South countries. I think this is also another significance that President Xi visit to Moscow.
Yeah, we understand that many of the BRICS nations leaders will attend. Professor Rong Ying, on China-Russia relations, we have a very robust and increasingly significant trading relations. $200 billion trade volume reached the year before. What do you make of this summit in terms of advancing China-Russia relations?
Yeah, this is again very much important in the context of what we have been talking about. The world we are living today is undergoing dramatic, unprecedented changes and transformation, and causing a lot of problems, challenges, raising the question that whether we are going to have the same or similar sort of a situation where 80 years ago and even more, the World War II broke. And that is largely, kind of a failure or the problem arising from state-to-state relationship. And also, I think the challenges arising from the common issues, or in today's sort of world, the global issues. And I think China and Russia, being close neighbors, has over the past decades sort of set up a kind of a example for major countries that as our neighbors to get along well, featuring a kind of non-confrontational, non-alliance, and not target at the third country. And in the meantime, not constrained by the third party. So this relationship has served as not only an example for major countries, new type of major country relation, but also provides a sense of stability and predictability, serving as a kind of strategic anchor for this fast changing and turbulent world. So we are expecting, definitely, President Xi during his state visit to be working closely with President Putin for further deepening and expanding that relationship, particularly based on the deep-rooted strategic trust to working on practical cooperations, which I think we have again see growing very fast. And but of course there are still a lot of room and scope for cooperation. Trade, as you have said, saying that has been growing very fast and exponentially, and investment to energy has always been. And the most important, equally important is people-to-people interactions. And so we're going to see more substantial and closer relationship that between the two sides, China and Russia relationship, setting an example, indeed, a new type of state-to-state relationship, major country relationship, a new era.
So much is said about China-Russia relations. Many in the West claim that this is a authoritarian axis. Mark, do you think China-Russia relations is oftentimes misinterpreted and misunderstood?
No, probably not. I think it's understood very well. At least in recent years. In the past decade, there has been a kind of a continual, it won't last attitude, not only among Western political elite, but among many Western academics in the field of international relations, that, the simmering tensions between Russia and China lie under the surface and they'll break out, and we don't need to worry about the Russian-Chinese, tacit alliance, let's be honest. Well, that they have all been proven extremely wrong for an extremely long period of time. The Russian-Chinese bilateral relationship is the single most stable, predictable, and important relationship in modern international relations. Single most, bar none. We see recently how just the shift from one president to another in the United States has shook transatlantic relationships between the U.S. and European leaders. In what in the last decades has been regarded as the signature bilateral relationships. Now, today the foundation, and it must be said, the foundation block of a multipolar world moving forward, first and foremost, will be built on the Russian-Chinese bilateral relationship. We can talk about other nexuses than the Russian and Chinese relationships with Iran, Russian relationship with India, and so forth. But it is the Russian-Chinese relationship that builds the bedrock foundation for moving on in that regard. And I think that the Russian and Chinese presidents both take a very long-term perspective in that regard and showcase that unity and goodwill together. While the rhetoric is the Russian-Chinese relationship, and its institutional expression in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other countries isn't targeted against any third parties, right? Isn't interested in geopolitics. But from a strictly offensive sense, that's true. But when you consider that the U.S.-led collective West is bent on global hegemony and the pursuit of global military primacy, any resistance, any alternative structures being built, any relationships that exist outside of the scope of that hegemony are considered a threat to that hegemony. And that is the way the West views the Russian-Chinese relationship, and they should be alarmed and scared, because it is a resistance and a threat to their hegemony.
Mark, thanks so much for your insight. Professor Rong Ying and Professor Zhao Long, thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for tuning in. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.